This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Reagan, His Life and Legend. From best-selling biographer Max Boot comes this revelatory portrait, a decade in the making of the actor turned politician whose telegenic leadership ushered in a transformative, conservative era in American politics. Despite his fame as a Hollywood star and television host, Reagan remained a man of profound contradictions, even to those closest to him. Reagan charts his epic journey from Depression-era America to morning in America, providing fresh insight into trickle-down economics, to the Cold War's end, the Iran-Contra affair, and so much more. This definitive biography is as compelling a presidential biography as any in recent decades. Max Boot, historian and foreign policy analyst, is a senior fellow for national security studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a columnist for the Washington Post. His New York Times bestseller, The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in biography. Happy to have for the first time on this podcast, Max Boot. Max, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So why Reagan as a subject for you?
Well, when I was starting this book in 2013, I knew there were a lot of books about Reagan, but there was not really one definitive biography that really captured his life and his career in an objective and balanced manner. And so that's what I set out to do, to write something that was neither a hagiography nor a hit job, but rather a fair and balanced account written with a perspective of historical hindsight and distance and objectivity that is an attempt to present both his strengths as well as his weaknesses, his successes as well as his failures. And so I was very gratified to read the New Yorker Review, which said Reagan, His Life and Legend aims to be the definitive biography, and it succeeds. So that was kind of my mission accomplished moment.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack here. Big question. So how did Reagan redefine Republican politics?
Well, he certainly moved the Republican Party to the right, although it's not nearly as far right as it is right now. But it's certainly to the right of where it was under Nixon and Ford. And, he kind of created these new passions for Republicans, like cutting taxes and appointing conservative judges. Those were hallmarks of his administration, as they have been for Republicans ever since. And he was, he had a deep skepticism of the government. In his inauguration address in 1981, one of his most famous lines was saying that in the current crisis, government isn't the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And that became kind of the mantra of Republicans ever since, although I think in other ways the Republican Party has evolved very far from Reagan's vision, because remember, he was somebody who was pro-immigration, pro-free trade, pro-NATO, and also, pro-compromise and working with Democrats. So in many ways, very different from today's Republicans, so much so that we might be said to be living in a post-Reagan era now.
I want to talk about your research process for this book. Pretty intense, unavailable archives now available. You used also interviews, nearly 100, with Reagan's aides and family members, many of whom have since passed away. Was there a common theme as you did these interviews about Reagan from these people?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a number of themes. One of them was that, Reagan in many ways was the same in private as he was in public, but he was, to those who knew him best, he was often somewhat inscrutable. They had trouble getting close to him. He was kind of amiable and aloof, whether in public or in private. So he, in some ways, remained a mystery, even to those closest to him. I think, another theme that consistently emerged was just how pragmatic he was and how intent he was on getting things done. He was somebody who always said that he would rather get 80% of what he wanted and come back for more rather than go over the cliff with his flags flying. And that was a term he often used to denote kind of absolutist conservatives who refused to compromise. And, his skill as a politician was that he kept the support of his base, and yet he was still able to compromise and work with Democrats and get things done.
Yeah, you talk about pragmatists too, and compromising. I remember interviewing Ron Reagan, his son, a few years back, and he said he hated confrontation. His father just did not like confrontation at all.
Yes, that was certainly one of the contradictions between the public and the private Reagan, because the public Reagan could be a very confrontational politician. He fired the air traffic controllers when they went on strike. He said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, etc. And yet, in private, as Ron Reagan said, and to you and to me as well, his father was very conflict averse and would not confront his kids, would not confront his aides. A lot of that, I think, really went back to his childhood, where so much of his personality was shaped by this difficult upbringing with his dad, Jack Reagan, who was this alcoholic shoe salesman, his mother, Nellie Reagan, who was kind of this very religious, almost saintly figure. But they were often in conflict because, Jack would go off on multi-day benders and spend the family rent money on booze and come back. And obviously, Nellie Reagan was not very happy about that. And so little Dutch Reagan, as he was known, did not enjoy hearing these arguments between his mother and father. And that kind of made him conflict averse throughout his life. And I think another legacy of that childhood, which also can seem somewhat counterintuitive given how genial and friendly Reagan seemed in public, was that he was actually kind of a loner, aloof, an introvert with almost no real friends. And that, I think, was, again, a product of this childhood where he was constantly moving from town to town, and he never really stayed in one place long enough to form fast friends. And he was also wary of getting too close to other kids because he didn't want anybody else to know the family secret about his father's drinking. And so he, began erecting this mental fence around himself that never really came down.
But he was the protector. He loved his job right at the Rock River as the lifeguard.
Yes. Yeah, that was certainly a formative experience for him throughout his high school and college years. He spent his summers as a lifeguard on the Rock River, and he saved 77 people from drowning. There were, in a later, more cynical age, there were skeptics who scoffed that, maybe a lot of these people were actually girls who just wanted to be, quote unquote, saved by the handsome lifeguard. But in fact, I think he really did save 77 people, and he became, kind of a small town hero. And he enjoyed the renown that he got as for his life-saving feats. Reagan was not very forthcoming about his psyche, but there was an interesting glimpse that he offered in this one movie magazine interview I found from the late 1930s, where he said, what did I like about lifeguarding? What I really liked about it, he said, was that he got to sit on this big lifeguard stand and have everybody look up to him, and he enjoyed having people look up to him.
What would Reagan, Max, think of the current GOP?
Well, hard to know, obviously. I think he would be kind of puzzled by it because it's so different in so many ways from the party that he led. I mean, remember, he was somebody who was pro-immigration. He signed a law that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants instead of, he wasn't rounding up millions of undocumented immigrants, he was legalizing them. He was pro-free trade, anti-tariffs. He was pro-alliances, pro-NATO in particular, pro-standing up to Russian aggression. And he just had a very gentlemanly style where he never engaged in invective or name-calling, never really attacked his opponents. He had a very sunny, upbeat, optimistic view of the world, saw America as a shining city on a hill, would never denigrate the United States or groups within it. So I think he would find himself, very, very far removed from today's Republican Party, such that he would probably be, called a rhino today, Republican in name only, because, he's so different from so many of today's MAGA Republicans.
I know you posed this question in the introduction to the book. Did Reaganism plant the seeds of Trumpism?
I think to some extent, yeah. I mean, I don't think Trumpism came out of nowhere. I think that, as I said, I think the differences between Reagan and Trump are greater than the similarities, but you can still find some continuities, including, they were both hosts of nationally televised shows. They were both populists who attacked the very government that they led. They were both fabulists who often trafficked in false facts and made up quotations. And, they were to some extent populists who nevertheless pursued economic policies that certainly favored the well-off. So you can kind of see how Reaganism might have prepared the Republican Party for Trumpism, but there's no question that Trump represents a major uh, turn of the Republican Party away from the Reagan legacy in so many ways.
What surprised you the most about Reagan after you went through all this research and finished this book? What are your takeaways with him?
I think the surprising thing is how pragmatic he ultimately was, which is at odds with this image as this conservative ideologue. And he could certainly be ideological, and especially on the campaign trail. But once in office, he was really a master of compromise. And, as governor of California, he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country, as well as a tough gun control bill. He increased spending. I mean, he railed against hippies and beatniks on college campuses, and yet nevertheless increased spending on higher education by 156%. And then the pattern was pretty much the same as president, where, he raised taxes more often than he cut them. As I mentioned, he legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. And ultimately, the greatest deal of all was the one that he made with Mikhail Gorbachev in his second term. After a lifetime as an anti-communist, Reagan spent his last years in office working hand in glove with the world's number one communist, Mikhail Gorbachev, to peacefully end the Cold War and reduce nuclear weapons. I think that was the ultimate tribute to his pragmatism and his ability to transcend his own ideology.
Max, I'm sure you get asked this often. Where does he rank now? And has his standing, do you think, improved?
Improved since he left office, you mean? Or
As best presidents ever.
oh,
And
well, I
since he
mean,
left office, yes.
yeah, I think no question it has. I mean, there was a poll of historians a few years ago that ranked him number 9 among all U.S. presidents. So, he's certainly not on the Mount Rushmore level. Nobody's going to confuse him with Washington, Lincoln, or Franklin Roosevelt. But I think he's kind of the next rung, and I think that's a judgment that makes sense. I think he was very divisive in office, but I think he has become more beloved in the decade since he left office and then left the earth. And I think there's a lot of nostalgia for him for understandable reasons, because he was a uniter, not a divider. Remember, this was a president who in 1980 won 44 states, and then in 1984 won 49 states. I mean, those seem like mythical, unbelievable accomplishments today, and yet he pulled them off. He managed to achieve a level of popularity that has been matched by very few politicians in U.S. history. And I think after he left office, you saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, those are all things that added to his credit. And even a lot of Democrats who were once critical of him came to look upon him fondly as someone who was more amiable and bipartisan than many of the Republicans who have succeeded him.
Yeah, you often hear, you mentioned it earlier, the shining city on the hill line. You've heard it a lot over the last 8 years, too, echoing Ronald Reagan. And finally, Max, what would you like readers to take away from this book?
Well, I'd like them to take away an appreciation for Reagan's complexity. And, he was often accused of having simplistic views, but he was not a simple man. And I think it's, he's not an easy person to understand. And that's something that I tried to do. And I think I tried to do justice to his many contradictions and complexities. And I think you really do have to understand, you have to have a proper appreciation and understanding of Ronald Reagan to really appreciate what happened to America in the 20th century and how we got to where we are in the 21st century.
And what is next for you in your writing?
That's a great question. I have to move on to a new project. I'm thinking about what that is, but at the moment, I'm just still wrapping up talking to folks about this project, which I spent more than 10 years working on.
This is a terrific book, Reagan, His Life and Legend. The author is Max Boot. Thank you for joining me.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast.